The morning Nathan Calloway missed his flight, everything had been perfect. That was the cruelest part. He'd left his house in Denver's Wash Park neighborhood at 7:40 a.m., a full 3 hours before his 10:45 departure. The travel planner on the passenger seat, dark leather, color-coded tabs, every detail locked in, showed the route in green. Traffic apps showed clear roads. He had his boarding pass loaded, his carry-on packed with exactly what he needed, no more. Nathan didn't believe in overpacking. He didn't believe in wasted space of any kind. He ran a risk management consultancy that served some of the largest logistics operations west of the Mississippi. His job was to see every failure point before it happened, to look at a system, find the crack, and close it before anything fell through. He was good at it, exceptionally good. And he'd applied the same philosophy to his personal life with the same ruthless efficiency. Every morning was scheduled. Every week was mapped. Every relationship in his life existed within clearly defined parameters, because parameters meant no surprises, and no surprises meant nothing blew up in his face. He'd learned that lesson the hard way 4 years ago when his marriage ended. Not dramatically, not with screaming or betrayal, just with two people who had slowly become strangers inside the same house, until one of them finally said out loud what both of them already knew. The divorce had cost him more than money. It had cost him the version of himself that still believed in improvisation. But today wasn't about any of that. Today was about a $14 million contract in Phoenix, a logistics firm that needed his firm's capacity assessment before their board meeting on Friday. All Nathan had to do was get on the plane, get to Scottsdale, shake some hands, and sign. Simple, clean, controlled. Then I-15 southbound turned into a parking lot. He heard it on the radio before he saw it. A jackknifed semi had spilled its load across 3 lanes at the I-215 interchange. By the time Nathan's rental sedan reached the jam, the highway was a wall of brake lights stretching further than he could see. He switched off the radio, gripped the wheel, checked the time on the dash every 45 seconds, as if watching it would make it move differently. It didn't. He called Diane, his assistant. She rerouted him through surface streets. He tried State Street, then Redwood Road, then a back way through the industrial district that shaved exactly 4 minutes off a delay that had already cost him 30. He thought about abandoning the car at a gas station and calling a ride, but there was no ride that could move through this. The city was locked. By the time he pulled into the short-term parking structure at Salt Lake City International, Section D, Row 7, because he always parked in the same section, it was 10:58. He grabbed his carry-on and ran. He already knew it was over before he reached the gate. The agent confirmed it with that professionally apologetic expression people put on when they've had to deliver the same news 1,000 times and have learned to do it without actually feeling it. The 10:45 to Phoenix had pushed back from the gate at 10:52. The next available seat was on the 5:30. Nathan didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He just looked at the boarding pass she printed him, nodded once, and walked into the terminal. He found a seat near the windows in Terminal B, set his carry-on beside him, and opened his travel planner. He crossed out the 10:45 flight time in the green column and wrote 5:30 in red. Then he sat back and stared at it. 6 hours and 42 minutes. That was what he had. He opened his laptop and tried to answer emails. There were 14 waiting. Updates from Diane, a draft from the Phoenix clients team, a reminder about a call he'd already moved twice. He typed a few lines, deleted them, typed again. His mind kept sliding off the screen and back to the contract, to the fact that Derek Vance's assistant had emailed yesterday asking if Nathan was fully committed to this timeline, which was the kind of passive-aggressive corporate phrasing that meant someone was watching, someone was nervous, someone was quietly considering their options. Nathan hated that. He hated the idea of being doubted. He hated even more that right now he deserved to be. He closed the laptop, leaned back. The terminal was loud in that particular airport way, overlapping announcements, rolling luggage, conversations in fragments. He wasn't hungry. He wasn't tired. He was just suspended. and he didn't know what to do with himself when he wasn't moving forward. He was sitting there, jaw tight, watching the gateboards scroll through departures, when he noticed her. She was near the exit that led down to the parking structure, the hallway that most people walked through without slowing down. She wasn't in a chair. She was on the floor, back against the wall, knees drawn up, a faded olive jacket zipped to the collar. Not asleep, not crying, not holding anything, just sitting there, very still, in the middle of all that motion. Nathan noticed her because she was the only thing in the terminal that wasn't moving. She was young, late 20s maybe. Dark hair pulled back loosely. Her face was clean, her posture quiet. She wasn't looking at her phone. She wasn't looking at anything in particular. She was just there, present and exhausted, like someone who had stopped trying to look like they were okay, but hadn't quite collapsed into not being okay either. Nathan told himself to look away. He was good at that. He'd spent 4 years perfecting the art of not engaging with things that weren't his problem. He had his own weight to carry. He didn't need anyone else's. But something about the way she sat there, not asking for anything, not performing distress, just sitting in the middle of all that noise like she'd accepted that the noise was going to keep happening regardless, made it impossible to fully look away. He stayed in his seat for another few minutes. He checked his phone. He looked at the gateboard. He thought about getting coffee. Then he stood up. He didn't make a decision exactly. His body just moved, the way it did sometimes in meetings when the right call was obvious even before he'd finished analyzing it. He walked toward the parking garage exit hallway with his hands in his pockets, keeping his expression neutral, which was easy because neutral was his default. When he got close enough, he stopped a few feet away. She looked up. Her eyes were dark and clear. Tired, yes, but aware. Not the eyes of someone who had given up. More like the eyes of someone who was just very, very done with today. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Nathan reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his wallet. He found 2 20s, $40, and held them toward her. It was a reflex, the kind of gesture he'd made before on city streets, the kind that let a person feel like they'd helped without actually getting involved. She looked at the bills in his hand. Then she looked back up at his face. She didn't take them. Nathan held them out a second longer, then lowered his hand slightly, uncertain. He was about to say something, some polite exit line, when she spoke first. "I don't need money." Her voice was soft, steady, not the voice of someone asking for pity. It was the voice of someone stating a fact, calmly, because they needed facts right now, not sympathy. Nathan blinked. "Okay," he said slowly. "What do you need?" She looked at him for a long moment like she was deciding something. Then she said, "A car." She reached up and wrapped her fingers around his wrist. Not hard, not frantic, just enough to make sure he didn't step back before she finished. Her hand was cold, colder than he expected. "I need to borrow a car," she said. "Just for a few hours. I need to get somewhere and back. I'll return it before your flight, I promise." Nathan looked down at her hand on his wrist. He looked back at her face. His mind had already started running the analysis. Probability of theft, probability of accident, probability of deception. All of it running in the background like it always did, fast and automatic. And every single output said the same thing. Do not do this. "I don't even know your name," he said. "Mara." "I don't know anything about you, Mara." "I know," she said. "I know that. But I don't have another option right now. I wouldn't ask if I did." She let go of his wrist. He hadn't pulled away. She'd just let go. And somehow that was worse, because now there was nothing keeping him there except his own choice. He took a step back. She let him. Her shoulders dropped slightly, not dramatically, just the quiet resignation of someone who already knew how most things ended. And Nathan felt something he hadn't felt in years, something that lived in the same part of his chest where the memory of his daughter's face used to break through his composure when he least expected it. That particular feeling of watching someone hurt and knowing you could do something, and choosing not to because choosing something always cost you. He should have walked away. That was the sensible, responsible, self-preserving thing to do. Instead, He stood there staring at a woman he didn't know and asked himself a question he hadn't asked since before the divorce. What if she's telling the truth? Nathan ran a hand through his hair. He looked around the terminal. Nobody was watching. The world was doing what it always did, moving, indifferent, fast. He looked back at her. She'd lowered her gaze to the floor. She wasn't pleading, she'd already accepted no. That look, that quiet, preemptive acceptance, did something to him. It reminded him of someone, not a specific person, a version of himself. The version that existed before the board meetings and the strategic plans and the carefully maintained emotional distance. The version that still believed people were worth the gamble. He reached into his jacket pocket. His fingers closed around his car key, a single key on a plain steel ring, nothing fancy. Practical, like the car, like everything he owned. His mind was still running its calculations. All of them said stop. His hand kept moving. He pulled the key out and looked at it for a moment, sitting in his palm. Then he looked at her. Section D, he said. Row 7, silver accord. Plate ends in 318. She looked at the key like she wasn't sure it was real. Bring it back by 4:30, he said. I'm boarding at 5. She stood slowly, unfolding from the floor. She was smaller than he'd expected. Up close, he could see the faint shadows under her eyes, the kind that didn't come from one bad night, but from a long run of them. She took the key from his palm carefully. Her fingers brushed his hand. Thank you, she said quietly. Nathan nodded. He didn't trust his voice right then. She tucked the key into her jacket pocket and looked at him one more time. Why are you doing this? He opened his mouth. Nothing came out that was honest enough to say. I don't know, he finally said. She nodded, as if that were enough, as if she understood it better than he did. Then she turned and walked toward the exit, threading through the foot traffic without hurrying, without looking back. Within seconds, she was gone, swallowed by the crowd and the sliding glass doors and the gray concrete beyond. Nathan stood there for a long moment, staring at the spot where she'd disappeared. The terminal noise came rushing back around him, the announcements, the wheeled luggage, the distant rumble of the ventilation system doing its best. He felt something strange, lighter somehow, but also untethered, like he'd just let go of a rope without knowing what was on the other end of it. He walked back to his seat. His laptop was still open, screen gone dim. He didn't touch it. He leaned back and closed his eyes and tried to quiet the part of his brain that was already building the worst-case scenarios. She sells the car. She disappears. He files a police report and spends the next 6 months dealing with the paperwork and the knowing looks from everyone who hears the story. He didn't call the police. He didn't call Diane either. He just sat there, his leather travel planner open on his knee, the color-coded columns meaning absolutely nothing to him right now. Nathan had built his post-divorce life on a single foundational premise, that control was the only reliable form of safety. He'd watched his marriage unravel from the inside, had felt the helplessness of caring about someone you can no longer reach, and he'd decided, quietly, deliberately, that he wasn't going to feel that helpless again. You controlled what you could. You kept your distance from the rest. You didn't hand your keys to strangers. But lately, and he'd tried not to examine this too closely, there had been a kind of hollowness creeping into the controlled hours, the moments when the work was done and the house was quiet and there was nothing left to structure. When Sophie was at her mom's and the rooms were too still and the whole carefully engineered life felt less like safety and more like a room he'd locked himself into from the inside. He'd told himself it was fine. That solitude and stability were the same thing if you tilted your head right. He was beginning to suspect that wasn't true. Nathan opened his eyes and checked the time. 11:52 a.m. He had until 4:30. That was nearly 5 hours. He stood up and went to get coffee. The line at the kiosk near Gate 14 was longer than it needed to be, the way airport lines always were. He stood in it with his hands in his pockets, listening to the barista run through orders in a voice that had clearly been doing this since 6 a.m. When he finally reached the counter and ordered a black coffee, no room, no sugar, no elaboration, he paid and took the cup and found a seat closer to the windows. The coffee was too hot and slightly bitter. He drank it anyway. He tried to read. He had a strategy brief on his phone that he'd been meaning to get through for 2 weeks. He got 3 paragraphs in before his mind slid away again. He tried calling his daughter. Sophie's phone went to voicemail. She was at school, of course. It was a Tuesday. And he listened to her outgoing message just to hear her voice for 8 seconds. Then he hung up without leaving one. He thought about Mara, where she was now, whether she'd found the car in the right spot, whether she'd figured out that the driver's seat ran a little far back and you had to slide it forward, whether she'd made it out of the parking structure without getting confused by the exit signs, which were genuinely terrible. He thought about what she was going back for. "Just a place I used to stay," she'd said. "It's not far." He hadn't pushed. He'd sensed, the way you sometimes sense things without a single piece of data to support it, that pushing would have been wrong, that whatever she was going back to get, it wasn't his to know. He'd made his choice. The rest was hers. An hour passed, then another. By 2:30, Nathan had moved twice, eaten a sandwich he didn't taste, and walked the length of Terminal B and back. He wasn't anxious exactly. He was something more specific. The feeling of having made an irreversible decision and having to live inside the waiting that came after it. He knew this feeling from business, from his divorce, from the long night before his custody arrangement was finalized, when he'd sat in his hotel room not knowing if he was going to see Sophie every other week or twice a month or something worse. You made the choice. Then you lived with the not knowing. That was the deal. By 3 o'clock, he'd begun doing the math on insurance. The Honda was 4 years old, mid-range, nothing flashy, bought for practicality. The claim would be annoying but manageable. He'd have to tell Diane. He'd have to come up with an explanation that didn't make him sound like he'd lost his mind. By 3:15, he'd mostly accepted that the car was gone. He stood at the windows overlooking the parking structure, the same view he'd been drifting back to all afternoon. He could see the entrance to Section D from here, but not Row 7. He stood there anyway, hands in his pockets, watching cars move in and out of the structure at the lazy pace of a Tuesday afternoon. His phone buzzed. "Unknown number," he answered. A text, not a call. "Your car is in Section D, Row 7. Key is under the front mat. Thank you." Nathan stood completely still. He read it again. Then a second message came through, 3 seconds later. "Please don't try to find me. Just know that what you did today saved me. You saw me like a person when I couldn't see myself that way anymore. I won't forget it." Nathan stood in the middle of Terminal B with people streaming past him on both sides and read both messages 4 times. His chest felt tight in a way that had nothing to do with anxiety. Something else entirely. Some emotion he'd gotten so good at not feeling that he'd almost forgotten what it felt like to be ambushed by one. He turned and walked toward the parking structure. If you've been following along, drop a comment below. I want to know if you've ever trusted a stranger when everything inside you said, don't. The parking structure smelled like concrete and exhaust, and the particular kind of damp that lives in covered spaces year-round. Nathan's footsteps echoed off the low ceiling as he took the ramp down to level D, his heart doing something irregular that he was choosing not to analyze. Row 7 came into view. The silver Accord was exactly where he'd left it that morning. No dents, no scratches, every panel exactly as it should be. He walked up to it slowly, scanning out of habit, and found nothing. Nothing wrong, nothing missing, nothing to justify the cold logic that had been telling him all afternoon to prepare for the worst. He crouched down and reached under the front floor mat. The key was there. He stood up and looked at it in his palm for a long moment. The same steel ring, the same plain key. She'd kept her word. Against every cynical expectation he'd built over 4 years of careful self-protection, she had come back. He unlocked the door and got in. The interior was exactly as he'd left it. His registration in the glove box. His travel planner on the passenger seat where he'd set it before he ran for the gate. Even the half-finished bottle of water in the door pocket he'd forgotten about since last week. The fuel gauge was lower, not drastically, but enough. She'd driven somewhere real, done whatever she needed to do, and come back. Nathan sat in the driver's seat with his hands on the wheel and let out a slow breath. The kind of breath you don't know you've been holding until it finally leaves. Then he noticed the passenger seat. A piece of paper, torn from the edge of something. A receipt, maybe, or a notebook page, folded once. Small. Easy to miss if you weren't looking. He picked it up. The handwriting was careful, deliberate. Each letter formed like it mattered. You didn't know me. You didn't owe me anything. But you looked at me like I was still worth something when I'd almost stopped believing that was true. I went back for something I left behind a long time ago. Something I thought was gone. Because of what you did, I have it back. I'm going to be okay, don't worry about me. I mean that. M. Nathan read it once, then again. Then he set it down on his knee and sat there in the quiet of the parking structure and let the words move through him slowly, like something thawing. You looked at me like I was still worth something. When was the last time someone had said that to him? Not about a contract, not about a quarterly result, but about something this plain and this enormous. When was the last time he'd done something that earned that? He didn't have an answer. He wasn't sure that was a coincidence. He folded the note and put it in his jacket pocket close to his chest. Then he locked the car, picked up his carry-on, and went back through the terminal. Boarding for the 5:30 to Phoenix started at 4:55. Nathan was in line, boarding pass ready, travel planner tucked under his arm. He got to his seat, window row 18, chosen weeks ago out of sheer habit, and stowed his bag and buckled in. As the plane filled around him, he set the travel planner on the empty middle seat and looked at it. All those tabs, all those color-coded columns, every hour of every day arranged so nothing could catch him off guard. He thought about the morning, the traffic, the missed flight, the 5 hours he hadn't scheduled. He thought about Mara sitting on the terminal floor, not asking for anything. He thought about the moment she took the key from his palm and the way she'd said, "Why are you doing this?" like the answer might actually surprise her. He thought about what he'd said. I don't know. He still didn't know, not exactly. But sitting here now with the note in his pocket and the city falling away below him as the plane climbed into the sunset, he understood something he hadn't before. The decision hadn't been reckless. It had been human. There was a difference. He'd just forgotten that. The man who used to know that difference had gotten very quiet over the past 4 years. Buried under the structure and the scheduling and the sensible refusal to feel anything he couldn't manage. But he hadn't disappeared. He'd just been waiting for a moment that couldn't be managed, a moment that didn't fit any protocol and required something else entirely. Nathan closed the travel planner. He didn't open it again for the rest of the flight. The meeting in Scottsdale went exactly as it was supposed to. He was at the client's offices by 8:45 the next morning. The room was clean and well lit, the kind of conference room that told you the company was doing fine without needing to say so. Derek Vance was cordial and professional. The team had reviewed Nathan's capacity assessment, and by 11 o'clock, the $14 million contract was signed, and the handshakes were firm and warm and meant exactly as much as handshakes in conference rooms always mean. Nathan's phone lit up with messages from Diane. "Congratulations! A press release draft for next week, a calendar invite for the follow-up call." All the machinery of his professional life clicking forward on schedule. He stood on the sidewalk outside the building in the Arizona sun and waited to feel the rush. It didn't come. What came instead was a kind of flatness. Not sadness exactly, but a very clear, quiet awareness that the thing he'd done yesterday in that airport meant more to him right now than this contract. That was inconvenient. It was also undeniably true. He got in the rental car and drove back to the hotel to grab his bag. The 14th floor of the hotel looked out over the Phoenix sprawl, that endless spread of low buildings and palm trees and afternoon glare. Nathan stood at the window for a few minutes before packing. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out the note. He'd read it on the plane. He'd read it again before he went to sleep last night. Now he read it a third time in the afternoon light. You looked at me like I was still worth something when I'd almost stopped believing that was true. He thought about all the people he moved through every day. The woman at the coffee kiosk in Terminal B who'd handed him a cup without looking up. The guy at the rental car counter who'd asked 3 times how the car was and got the same distracted, "Fine, fine," back each time. His building's night security guard who said good evening every time Nathan left late and never once got a real answer about how his evening actually was. Nathan knew their faces. He probably knew a few of their names. But did he see them? Did he treat them like people or like the background of his own more important story? He thought about Sophie, 15 now, sharp and perceptive in the way teenagers are when they've watched their parents navigate a painful thing and drawn their own quiet conclusions. He thought about the kind of man he wanted her to see when she looked at him. Not the one who closed the deal. Not the one who had every risk calculated and every minute scheduled. The one who looked at someone on a terminal floor and decided they were worth the gamble. He put the note back in his pocket, finished packing, caught his flight home. The flight back to Salt Lake City was full and a little bumpy over Nevada, which Nathan barely noticed. He had a middle seat between a college kid with headphones and an older woman with a thick paperback, and he sat between them contentedly for 2 hours, watching the terrain change below and thinking about things that had nothing to do with work. He thought about calling his ex-wife, not to reopen anything, that door was appropriately and permanently closed, but to tell her that Sophie should hear from him sometime soon that kindness wasn't a weakness, that he'd gotten confused about that for a while and he was unconfusing himself, and he wanted her to know that before she was old enough to have already decided what kind of person her father was. He thought he might actually make that call. The plane landed mid-afternoon, and Nathan took the shuttle to the parking structure, walked down to level D, found row 7, and got into the same silver Accord he'd lent to a stranger the day before. He sat in the driver's seat and rested his hands on the wheel for a moment. The note was still in his pocket. He started the engine and drove. The drive home through SLC and up into the foothills felt different in a way Nathan couldn't fully articulate. The traffic was light. The afternoon sky was doing something spectacular with pink and gold above the Wasatch Range to the east, the kind of sky that happened every other day in Utah and that he almost never actually looked at. He looked at it now. He thought about Mara. He didn't know what she'd gone back for, something she'd left behind, she'd said, something she'd thought was gone. He turned that over in his mind and decided he didn't need it explained. Some things were private. Some things belonged entirely to the person carrying them. What he did know was that she'd kept her word, that she'd trusted him enough to ask for help and then honored that trust completely, and that in doing so, she'd handed him something he hadn't realized he needed, a reminder that people still did that trust still moved through the world, that the transactions you couldn't put in a spreadsheet were sometimes the ones that actually mattered. Nathan had built his whole professional reputation on identifying the weakest point in a system, the place where things fell apart, and he was very good at it. But somewhere in the past 4 years, he'd started applying that same lens to every human interaction, looking for the failure mode, the angle, the reason things would eventually go wrong. It was exhausting, and it had made him gradually and almost invisibly into someone he didn't entirely like. He didn't have to live that way. That wasn't a revelation exactly. It was more like a thing he'd always known being handed back to him, polished up after a long time in someone else's pocket. He pulled into his driveway as the last of the daylight was leaving. The house was dark. He sat in the car for a moment with the engine off, listening to the quiet. Then he got out, locked the door, walked inside. He turned the lights on in the kitchen, set his bag down, and made himself a cup of tea he didn't actually want, just to have something to do with his hands. He stood at the counter and drank it and looked around the kitchen and thought about how long it had been since he'd had someone over for dinner, since he'd cooked something that wasn't for one, since he'd done anything in this house that felt like living in it rather than just occupying it. He took out his phone and texted Sophie. "Hey, thinking about you. Hope school was okay today. Call me when you can. No emergency, I just want to hear your voice." Her response came back 7 minutes later. "Dad, you're being weird. I'll call after soccer. Love you." He smiled at the screen for longer than was probably dignified for a man in his 40s. Then he walked to his desk, opened the center drawer, and found a small wooden box he kept there. The kind people use for receipts and spare batteries and things they don't know where else to put. He opened it, cleared a space, and set Mara's note inside. Folded, careful, in the corner. He closed the box. He didn't need to read it again. He had it somewhere more permanent now. The thing about kindness is that it doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come with a memo or a calendar invite or a color-coded tab. It happens in the space between one decision and the next, in the moment when you could easily keep walking and you don't. When you could say, "Not my problem," and you can't quite make yourself mean it. Nathan Calloway had spent 4 years narrowing that space down to almost nothing, building walls around the parts of himself that could be hurt, which, as it turned out, were the same parts that could be moved and surprised and quietly changed by a stranger's note left on a passenger seat. He wasn't going to reinvent his life. He wasn't going to quit the firm or move to the mountains or start volunteering every weekend. He was going to go back to work on Thursday and answer Diane's emails and prepare for the next client and do all the things that his life actually required. But he was going to do something else, too. He was going to pay attention, really pay attention, to the barista, the security guard, the people who lived in the margins of his carefully organized days. He was going to let himself see them instead of moving through them. Because that was the whole thing, wasn't it? That was what Mara had asked for without asking. Not charity, not a rescue, just to be seen. And it had cost him nothing. It had cost him nothing, and it had meant everything. Nathan turned off the kitchen light and walked down the hall to his bedroom. The house was still quiet. The neighborhood outside was doing its evening thing. The low hum of someone's TV, a dog somewhere, the occasional car. He changed his clothes, sat on the edge of the bed. He thought about what the note had said. "You didn't know me. You didn't owe me anything." True. Both of those things were true. But that was exactly why it mattered. He lay back and looked at the ceiling, and for the first time in longer than he could accurately remember, he didn't reach for his phone. He didn't go over tomorrow's schedule. He didn't run the mental inventory of things unfinished and risks unaddressed. He just let himself be still. When he fell asleep, it was earlier than usual, and the sleep came easily. None of the grinding, restless wakefulness that had followed him home from most business trips. Just dark and quiet and rest. Somewhere out there, Mara had found what she'd gone back for. He believed that. He didn't know why he believed it, but he did, with the same gut certainty that had put his keys in her hand in the first place. She was going to be okay. She'd said so herself, and something in the way she'd written it told him it was true, not hope, fact. He hoped she knew that what she'd given him mattered too. He suspected she did. The next morning, Nathan woke up before his alarm, which was unusual. He made coffee, stood on his back porch in the early morning chill, and watched the light come up over the neighborhood. The Wasatch Peaks were sharp and clear to the east, the way they only get after the air has been scrubbed by a front moving through. He thought about going for a run. He hadn't run in years, not since before the divorce, when he'd had a different relationship with his own body. He pulled on his shoes and went anyway. He ran badly and slowly, and his lungs complained by the end of the second block. He kept going. He ran for 25 minutes, which wasn't long by any measure, and came back out of breath and slightly ridiculous and feeling, for reasons he couldn't entirely explain, like himself. He got in the shower, made breakfast, called Sophie before she left for school, and she answered this time, and they talked for 11 minutes about her soccer game and a history project, and whether he'd seen the movie she'd texted him about 3 weeks ago that he'd said he'd watch, and obviously hadn't. "I'll watch it this weekend," he said. "You always say that." "This time I mean it." She laughed, that easy, rolling laugh that was entirely her own, and said goodbye and hung up, and Nathan stood in his kitchen with the phone in his hand and smiled. He put the leather travel planner on the counter, looked at it. Then he opened it to a blank page. There were several near the back, never used, and wrote one thing: "See them." He closed it again, tucked it in his bag, headed to the office. Life went on. The contract in Phoenix processed as expected. Diane scheduled the press release. The firm's capacity numbers moved in the right direction. The next client arrived, and the one after that, and Nathan did his job with the same precision and competence he always had. But something was different. Not dramatically, not in any way that would show up on a quarterly report, but in the small daily calibrations of how he moved through the world. The barista whose name he learned was Priya, and who, as it turned out, was working 2 jobs to finish her accounting degree. The security guard in his building who'd just become a grandfather and whose face lit up when asked about it. The colleague he'd always treated as pleasant but peripheral, who, over lunch one Tuesday, turned out to have a story that was genuinely extraordinary. People. Just people. All of them going somewhere, all of them carrying something. He just hadn't been looking. He looked now. He never found out what Mara had gone back for. He never heard from that unknown number again, never saw her face in a crowd, never had the story tied up with the kind of clean ending that makes things easier to carry. That was okay. That was, he came to understand, exactly how it was supposed to be. The gesture hadn't been an investment. It hadn't been a transaction. It had been a choice, freely made, freely honored, and the meaning of it didn't depend on knowing how it ended. He still had her note. In the wooden box in his desk drawer, folded in the corner, next to an old birthday card from Sophie and a photo from a hiking trip he'd taken years ago and almost forgotten. You didn't know me. You didn't owe me anything. But you looked at me like I was still worth something when I'd almost stopped believing that was true. He read it every now and then. Not to feel good about himself, that wasn't the point. He read it to remember that the gap between who he'd been and who he wanted to be was crossable. That it could be crossed in a single moment if you were paying enough attention to recognize when the moment arrived. Nathan Calloway had built his career on calculating risk, on knowing the probability of failure before he committed to anything. And by that measure, handing his keys to a stranger in an airport was the worst decision he'd ever made. It was also the best. Not because it worked out, not because she brought the car back, but because in making it, in ignoring the calculation for one clear-eyed moment and choosing to believe in a person he had no reason to trust, he had found his way back to something he'd thought he'd lost for good. The part of himself that still believed people were worth it. The part that hadn't gone away. It had just been waiting quietly for him to catch up. Sometimes the wall you've built to protect yourself is the same wall that keeps you from being reached. And sometimes it only takes one moment, one choice that doesn't make sense on paper, one act of trust extended across the distance between 2 strangers, to remember that the wall was never the point. You were always the point, and you can always find your way back.